She's quite a quiet, modest person, so she really doesn't talk much about herself at all. She talked a fair amount about Estonia, so I've always had a picture in my mind of Estonia as a really wonderful place, really kind of a paradise, and everything was always best in Estonia. I mean, Swiss chocolates are good, but not as good as the chocolates were in the day of free Estonia. So I had that picture. She did mention that she was an orphan, and she did talk about escaping from the communists, so I had a vague idea of that, of her father being taken to Siberia and of her mother dying and of escaping Estonia, but I never, until I was much older, probably 15, really ever pieced together the whole story and about how there were really two escapes, not one.
When she was 2, she was orphaned when they were trying to flee to Estonia.
I know she had a very tough time growing up, and it really makes me appreciate the life that I'm able to live now.
Her uncle then got her back out to Estonia because he was in charge of a shipping company. So he got her out and into a family, a group of farmers, I believe.
I think it's very important to live in the service of others, and that's something I try to do in my daily life, and it's really an example my parents and my grandparents have always set for me.
She really clearly loved her foster family. They were very kind to her and raised her as their own. She would talk about when she first came to them at age about 4, how she often had awful nightmares because of her terrible time in Russia and escaping when she was younger, and that her mother would always just let her come into her bed and comfort her, and how kind they were.
Discuss Estonia? Oh, that was, of course, always on Olga's mind. Yeah, she is not just an Estonian, but a devoted Estonian. For her, Estonia is the paradise, kind of, or at least the best place on earth to live. She has great admiration, great respect, and it's true that Estonians are special people.
Once she came home with grades that were less than stellar, and they said, "Oh, we are not used to that in our family." And after that, she knew that she had to do better and always brought home the best grades.
She grew up in Estonia, and then when Russian communists again moved in, then she definitely, that is when she just had time to make her doctor's degree and had to compress very much. And then the Russian communists moved in and took over, and she left right before the last minute. She was able to leave and go to Germany.
But then eventually, when the Russians came and occupied Estonia, she escaped in her 20s.
My grandfather was Estonian. He came from a farming family. They'd lived in Estonia certainly for hundreds of years. My grandfather wanted to study medicine, and he, in those days, I guess there wasn't so much chance to do that in Estonia, so he left Estonia to study medicine in Kiev. But he was always a very proud Estonian and very much of a nationalist, and after the revolution, he was still working as an Estonian nationalist, pro-Estonia, and also helping, I think, along with his brother, to repatriate some of the Estonian railroad assets, and he was part of the Estonian Home Guard. So that was also a big black mark with the Soviets, and perhaps one of the things that got the charges framed against him to send him off to Siberia. So she was born actually in Kiev in the Ukraine. Her father was studying to be a doctor at the time, and his father only paid for the education of the youngest son, who studied agronomy and was going to take over the farm. So her father had to find his own way to finance his studies, and so he took a job tutoring the younger brothers of her mother and met her mother in that fashion. And so her mother was part of the aristocracy, if you have it, living in the Tsarist Russia at the time. They were originally Baltic Germans and Polish and Romanian, but they had lived in the Russian Empire for many, probably hundreds of years. And so she was from a mixed background. And I often thought that was unusual as well, that the son of a freed serf would marry the daughter of a Tsarist general. But she said her mother's family was very liberal and completely accepting of him. So that was her family background. And when she was born, of course, the revolution had happened already, and there was still a lot of fighting and violence. So when my mother was 2, when they were living in Moscow temporarily, trying to get the papers to cross the border and get back to Estonia, her mother died, possibly of meningitis, we don't know, and just a few months later the Soviets came, took my grandfather and brought him to Siberia. So my mother was 2. Fortunately, her brother was 7, so he could care for her a little bit, but they were stuck in this apartment really with no one to take care of them. But her uncle then, who was in charge of repatriating the Estonian railroad assets, found them there and arranged for them to go back to Estonia with a couple who were traveling that way. And they first were on a farm with some of their relatives, but these relatives were very, very old and couldn't really take care of children. And my uncle was a bachelor, so he took my mother's brother Adu, who was 7 at the time, because he could put him in boarding school and be his guardian, so that worked, but my mother was only 2. The other relatives on the Vabamu farm commented that the only thing that she had with her was a distended stomach from malnutrition and fleas. So she was in pretty bad shape when she first arrived over there. So then he found a couple, German man, I think, who was running one of the Estonian farm estates. But unfortunately, right after they brought her to the estate to get to know her prospective foster parents, this wife died. So my poor mother was again out of luck and without a family to take her. So I think from age 2 to 4, she lived with the old relatives on the Vabamu farm for a while. Then she was at this estate, and then the Olga family came to spend the summer on this farm for their summer vacations. And my mother played with Gosti and Jutta, who were quite a bit older than her, and really liked the Olga family a lot. And when the Olga family was about to leave, then my mother, I think, went to them and said, "Oh, please, please don't leave me here. Please take me with you." And they did. They had had a 3rd child, an older daughter who had just died of scarlet fever the year before. So they had a vacancy in the family, and so they agreed to take my mother as their foster child.
Well, what I know about Estonia is that on paper it looks like a small and insignificant country, but it's so culturally active and prosperous, and the character of the people there is so good. They have a giant festival every year in their capital, and half the country or more than that shows up, which is just huge. Their song festival.
She talked about people making fun of her name because she has more of a Russian name, Olga. And so she went by Olli, and so she talked about children on the playground making fun of that. Otherwise, pretty much all just seemed like a pleasant life in free Estonia, being brought up by her foster family. They lived upstairs in the schoolhouse because her mother was the principal. And so I think she had a very good, stable family life. Her brother and sister were quite a bit older than her, so she talked about always having hand-me-downs and having a rusty old boy's bike that her brother had used, and about how she never learned to ski because her sister had the skis first and took good care of them, and then her brother broke them, so she never learned to ski. Once during that time, apparently some relatives from her mother's side of the family came to the Oleks and said, "Well, you know here, this child you're raising is the granddaughter of a very important Tsarist general, and you'd better raise her in the right way and take special care." And they said, "Well, we don't care about that at all. She's just Estonian, she's one of us," and that was that, and those relatives never came again. So my mother has always really felt herself to be a complete Estonian and totally part of the regular Estonian life, and I think had kind of a disdain as well for all the social classes and aristocracy. She just wants to be a real Estonian.
Her greatest achievement in a way for her, important for her future life, was to escape before the communists moved in. Communists didn't want anybody to leave. They wanted to keep all people in their paradise.
I think she felt that she was probably going to be not well received in the Soviet Union because she already had a father that had been to Siberia for 10 years, so that was a black mark. Her mother had been part of the Tsarist aristocracy, that was another black mark. So I think, and then she, like all the other Estonians, saw what went on during the first Russian occupation with the mass deportations and the killings, and so I think it was pretty clear in her mind that she needed to leave. And she talked with her foster family about this, and her foster parents, she said, encouraged her to leave. They said they couldn't, they were too old, they needed to stay, but they told her, yes, you should go ahead.
And she barely succeeded. Last ship she could take to leave Estonia was shot at with machine guns from the air, from the Russian airplanes. They had to go underneath the deckers into cabins, and the noise of the machine gun bullets that hit the metal of the boat was tremendous, she said. It was awful noisy. You'd think the boat would be totally destroyed. There were two last ships leaving. One ship was sunk by the Russians. She was very lucky. Her ship survived.
And one of them was a Red Cross ship, and clearly marked as a Red Cross ship, which by the international conventions of war was not supposed to be bombed. But the Soviets bombed it anyway and sunk it. And she told me of a friend she had on that ship who had a young baby and tried to save her baby, and so they both drowned. And then her ship escaped the bombing, but then circled back later and picked up as many of the refugees still floating in the water as they could, and they went to Germany.
She spent quite a few years in Germany, actually in a camp. The Germans established camps for the Eastern people who were chased out through communists. So she worked in a camp as a camp doctor, so she had a good position.
She tells a story of knocking on many doors trying to find a room to live in, and nobody had any rooms. And finally, somebody, after closing the door on her, poked their head back out of the door and said, ja, wenn man sympathisch ist, or yeah, so they clearly liked her and said, okay, we'll fit you in. And I know that she studied ophthalmology there in the eye hospital in Erlangen in Germany, finished her studies. She said that she knew that Germany was finished, was just crumbling and completely depleted by war, and there was no life for her there. So she wanted to come to America, and she knew that her chances were greater if she went to a DP camp. So she went then to this displaced persons camp, and she worked there as the camp doctor for several years, I believe, until she was finally sponsored to come to America.
Both Olga and me lived in Buffalo. I was starting a company and needed facilities and space for having offices and later some manufacturing. And Olga was working for another doctor but wanted to become independent, so she also had need of space. We both had the same condition insofar as neither one had any money. So we ended up looking at the same building, being in the same building, two young professionals, one a guy, one a lady. We were unavoidable that we would notice each other, meet each other, and finally got married.
She had to wait to get a sponsor, just as I think all the other DPs pretty much had to wait for a sponsor. And she said it came about because there was an Estonian pastor in New York City who did a great deal to help the Estonians, and he somehow had connections with this Methodist church in Buffalo and encouraged them to sponsor Estonians. Then she came to Buffalo, New York, and they didn't accept the degrees that she had from Estonia and from Erlangen, so she had to do her medical exams all over again, and then she had to do her residency all over again. And so she spent many more years working extremely hard and not having much money at all before she was finally qualified as an American doctor. And then she went to the Estonian church in Buffalo and then later in Seattle, and I think that was for God as well as largely for community. She really loved the Estonian community, and most of her friends were Estonian.
Number one, she was an intellectual and, of course, professional. She even had a doctor's degree, which I didn't have. We were both working. We had a daughter, Sylvia.
My father came to America to follow his dreams. He had a very comfortable life with a very good job as a physicist in Switzerland, in a place that's a beautiful country with comfort, family, everything one could hope for, yet he decided he didn't want to work at the same job and get a gold watch 50 years later. He wanted to follow his dreams.
When I say my business, it was mostly my ideas, my instruments, but I was not a full owner. I only owned 40% of the business. My helpers used, my friends and helpers had the rest of the ownership. So the company was sold, but I stayed with the company as the president, and the new owners, they decided to move the company to Seattle.
My mother did talk a bit about getting started as a doctor in America, and she did talk about how rare it was to have female doctors, and mentioned that some people made unpleasant comments about wanting to be a doctor just so she could see men with their clothes off and things like that, which was because there were very, very few female doctors at the time. She mentioned that they would have medical meetings in the Buffalo Country Club, but she had to go in through the kitchen because the main entrance was just for men only.
After all, my wife had her practice in Buffalo, and all her customers are there, and her activity, and her friends. For her to move to Seattle, that was quite giving up a lot.
She made her career and her life in the United States and loved her adopted country, the United States, but at the same time she never forgot Estonia.
In 1976, I suggested we go to Estonia again to see her country. Our daughter Sylvia was then 16 years old, but Olga was reluctant. Olga was very much worried and scared that she would be kept, that she couldn't even come back home. But I told her there is no worry at all. I don't have a worry, I'm Swiss, and I will get her back out.
We went to the hotel and it was very guarded and monitored. There was a Soviet lady with her little kerchief on every floor, making sure that everyone behaved. The doors only locked on the outside, not the inside. There were microphones in our room as well, little microphone holes in the wall, so that we had the feeling that we could be eavesdropped on whenever they felt like it. When we left the hotel and came back, we could tell that our suitcases had been rifled through. We could speak pretty freely with our relatives. Even then, we were more afraid than they were, and they were then, don't worry, nobody's listening here, and so we had a nice free time with them. It was a great chance to get to see my cousins whom I've never met before, and we made a trip to Tartu where my mother had attended university, and many of our relatives came with us, but our whole itinerary and everything was quite strongly controlled by the Soviets, and what we could see and what we could not see, and we had our minder. So we went there in a Soviet microbus with a guide and a driver. And the journey there was quite interesting too. As we had gotten part of the way there, the wheels started to fall off. So the driver had to stop and hammer and use the crowbar a bit and then get it back on. And in that time we had a long rest by some farm fields, and they had big haystacks. And I was 14 at the time. It was fun to climb up to the top and sit in the haystack.
And then when we went later on, when there was no more communism in Estonia, we went several times, and then of course was nice.
It had changed so completely, and the main thing that changed in Estonia between those years was the mental attitude. It was just vibrant and lively and full of life and full of color, and you could tell that people were active and happy, and things were really, really blossoming in Estonia.
In summer, Estonia is very nice. Tallinn, it's warm, it's sunny, and people enjoy it very much after a long winter. Activities are all out. In the old city, along the streets, is all restaurant tables with people drinking beer and enjoying the warm weather. You feel very relaxed atmosphere, very pleasant.
But when Estonia again became free, my mother was extremely happy, and I think most of the expat community in America were all extremely happy to finally have freedom back for their country again. And my mother took the opportunity to make several visits there in the 1990s. And I remember when my husband and family and I would travel with her, we noticed how she would just get more energy and more vibrancy when she was in Estonia.
And get, of course, lots of inputs and emotional feelings from my wife. So that gives me a very accurate, I would say, very accurate and profound feel relationship to the Estonian people. I had a business with a friend. I helped him start the business with some $50,000. And he sure recognized this help. He was very generous, very good to me after the business succeeded. It turned out to be a tremendous investment, 100 or 1,000 times its value.
She always loved her country. She always remembered it. She always kept in strong ties with the Estonian communities wherever she lived. And she, when it came time that she was able to do philanthropy and give back, her first thought, of course, was to give back to her homeland of Estonia.
We ended up suddenly to be quite rich, I could say, after with all these events.
I remember first there was a discussion of perhaps providing some scholarship for medical students in Estonia or other students. And then I believe that she talked to Dune and Marianne Kellum, and they felt very strongly that what was needed was a museum to memorialize the past and memorialize the occupation period. Because it's certainly the case that if we forget history, we're prone to repeat it. And the idea then was very strong that we had to make something that would show the past so that it was never repeated.
It's important to teach younger generations about what's happened in the past because we can really learn from history, and it's good to have an appreciation for it.
I think the collaboration with Stanford University is very important. Mike Keller, Stanford librarian, has been extremely supportive of the museum in Estonia and has traveled to Estonia probably more than a half a dozen times in the last 3 years. He has hired a curator who will help build the collection in Stanford of Estonian and Baltic artifacts and books and manuscripts. The museum has been visited by a lot of Estonians. It continues to have high visitation numbers. What I would like to see in the future is see it increase its connection with the Estonian community and increase its educational functions, do a lot more teaching with students and young Estonians, and really try and draw in the new generations of Estonians who perhaps don't remember the occupation period. And I know that my mother was always extremely grateful to the Olga family, her foster family. Her love of Estonia and her love of free Estonia, I think, is largely attributable to them and all the care and that they showed her. And she also always tried to give back to them, and later on when they had a grandchild who had some troubles with her hips, my mother offered to help pay for the operation and help them manage, because she had just such a tremendous debt of gratitude to the Olgas. I remember the trip in 1997 where she was already in America, quite old and having trouble walking upstairs and going slowly. As soon as we got to Estonia, it was like the air changed her. She became just 20 years younger and vibrant and walked up the steps and the roads up Toompea Hill with no problem at all, and just seemed to exude a happiness and a radiance to be back in free Estonia again.